When Marcus and Evelyn found their dream house, it felt like fate. Tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, the house was an old colonial with a timeless charm. It was weathered but sturdy, with a grand staircase, old-fashioned crown moldings, and a fireplace they could already imagine crackling during winter. It was almost too perfect. They closed the deal quickly and moved in within the week, excited to start fresh in their new home. The first night felt like a honeymoon. They wandered from room to room, marveling at their fortune, talking about where they'd place their furniture. By midnight, they were exhausted. Marcus noticed the air was still, heavy, as if waiting for something. The creaking of the old house was louder than he'd expected, but he brushed it off as the natural sounds of an old home settling. Around 3 a.m., Evelyn shook Marcus awake. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Groggy, he listened. There was a faint shuffling coming from somewhere downstairs. They dismissed it as an animal or a draft and tried to fall back asleep, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was listening, watching. The next few days were peaceful, but little oddities kept piling up. Every morning, they'd wake to find the closet doors open or the chairs around the dining table slightly pulled out. They laughed it off, blaming exhaustion from the move, but both started feeling an underlying unease. Evelyn tried not to focus on the strange chill she'd get whenever she walked by the narrow hall at the back of the house, the one with the old family portraits they couldn't bring themselves to take down. Every time she passed, she felt as though someone was watching her, tracking her every movement. Then there was the basement. The light flickered ominously, casting eerie shadows on the rough concrete walls. They avoided it unless absolutely necessary, as if they both intuitively knew something was wrong down there. The basement felt like it was from another world, one that didn't belong in their cozy home. It smelled old, like something rotting. One night, while Marcus was away on a business trip, Evelyn stayed up late watching a movie. Around midnight, she heard a loud banging coming from the basement. Her heart froze. She grabbed a flashlight and slowly descended the stairs, each creak amplifying her heartbeat. When she reached the bottom, the flashlight flickered. The room was empty, but the cold was biting. Suddenly, she heard a whisper, a low, guttural sound, like someone struggling to speak. She turned around, shining her light frantically, but there was no one there. Shaken, she bolted back upstairs and locked the basement door. The next day, she found scratches on the inside of the basement door. Faint, but visible, as though something or someone had tried to claw its way out. She didn't tell Marcus, hoping it was a trick of her imagination. A week later, the disturbances intensified. Lights turned on and off on their own, strange noises echoed through the house, and Marcus found deep scratches on the walls of the upstairs bedroom. Each night, they could hear a faint humming, a melody that neither of them recognized, drifting down the hallways. It was always loudest near the old family portraits, particularly near the painting of a young woman with hauntingly dark eyes. Desperate, Evelyn researched the house's history. She discovered that the original owners had lost their daughter in the house in a tragic accident. And since then, subsequent owners had reported strange occurrences before moving out in a hurry. The story went that the daughter had been locked in the basement by her father for reasons unknown, and no one had seen her come out. That night, Marcus and Evelyn decided to confront whatever was tormenting them. They went down to the basement together, armed with flashlights. The light above them flickered erratically, casting sinister shadows. They barely had time to look around when they heard the door slam shut behind them. Panic surged as they rushed back up the stairs, pounding on the door, yelling, but it wouldn't budge. Then came the whispering. Close, right behind them. They could feel icy breath on their necks, hear a faint, desperate voice saying, "Help me." The flashlight died, plunging them into darkness. Desperate, Marcus tried to pry the door open, but it felt like an invisible force was holding it shut. The voice grew louder, more insistent. Something cold touched Evelyn's shoulder, and she let out a scream. With a sudden force, the door flew open, and they stumbled out, gasping for air. They didn't stay in that house another night. They packed a few belongings and drove to a hotel, their hearts racing, refusing to look back. The next morning, they went back one last time to retrieve the rest of their things. As they were leaving, Marcus glanced at the portrait of the young woman in the hallway. Her eyes seemed sharper, almost mocking, as if she were daring them to return. They left, abandoning the house and never looking back. The house remains on the market, beautiful yet cursed, waiting patiently for its next tenants. When Lily and John moved into their new house, it felt like a new beginning. The place was surprisingly affordable for such a beautiful Victorian home, a fact they chalked up to the area being slightly isolated. The house was full of quaint quirks, ornate wooden moldings, tall arched windows, and a dusty old mirror bolted into the hallway wall. The mirror was tarnished, with a murky film clouding its reflection, but it was a permanent fixture the owner warned them not to remove. Lily found it charming, though something about its dull surface made her uneasy, almost like something was trapped behind it, waiting. On their first night, they both felt the chill. The walls were cold, and no amount of heating seemed to keep the place warm. As they settled in, the noises started. It began as faint whispers, soft enough to brush off as the wind rattling through cracks. But one night, as Lily lay half asleep, she heard it clearly, a low murmur coming from the hallway. She strained to listen, but it stopped the moment she focused on it. She was wide awake now, a deep unease settling over her as she stared at the ceiling, too afraid to turn her head. The next morning, she brushed it off and didn't mention it to John, but each night it grew worse. Shadows would dart along the walls, flickering in her peripheral vision, always gone the second she turned her head. One evening, as she was cleaning up in the kitchen, she glanced out the window and thought she saw someone standing by the edge of their garden, just a dark figure, staring directly at her. She blinked, and it was gone. But the mirror, that was the worst part. Every time she passed it, she felt like something was watching her. One night, she dared herself to look closer, leaning in until her breath fogged the glass. For a second, she thought she saw something behind her in the reflection, a dark shape, far back in the hallway, just out of the light's reach. She whipped around, but there was nothing there. One evening, while John was working late, she tried to distract herself by cleaning up the spare room. While moving some boxes, she found a small leather-bound book. Its pages were brittle with age, and most of the words were faded, but one entry caught her eye. The writing was frantic, the ink smeared as though written by a hand that couldn't stop shaking. It described a presence that lived within the mirror, something that watched, waited, and micked. The author, whoever they were, wrote about seeing a reflection that smiled when they didn't, that followed them even after they'd turned away. Her heart pounded as she read, her hands trembling. Suddenly she heard a thud from the hallway. She stood up, her pulse racing. As she stepped into the hallway, she saw the mirror, a dark shape moving within it. She froze, watching as her own reflection slowly tilted its head, grinning in a twisted, unnatural way. Unable to look away, she backed up, her breath shallow. Her reflection lifted its hand slowly, waving, and she realized with horror that it wasn't her. She ran into the bedroom, locking the door, her back pressed against it as she tried to calm down. She heard footsteps outside, soft but deliberate. They stopped in front of the door, and she could hear a faint scratching, as if someone were gently raking their nails along the wood. When John came home, he found her curled up on the floor, trembling, the door locked from the inside. She told him everything, but he dismissed it as stress from the move. Reluctantly, she agreed, but every time she passed the mirror, she could feel it watching her, that twisted, mocking smile waiting just beneath the surface. One night, John woke up to find Lily standing in the hallway, staring at the mirror. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, her face pale. He called out to her, but she didn't respond, her gaze fixed on her reflection. He reached out to touch her shoulder, and she jerked violently, snapping out of her trance. "It was smiling," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It was smiling at me." They called in a mirror specialist, an elderly man who claimed to understand such oddities. When he arrived, he ran his fingers along the edges of the glass, murmuring to himself. Finally, he said, "You need to leave. This mirror isn't just glass. It's a doorway, a portal that lets things through. And this one's been used before. It remembers." They packed that night, leaving the mirror untouched. They never looked back, but on some quiet nights, they could swear they still felt it, watching from the darkened reflections, waiting to be seen again. Megan and Brian were ecstatic when they found their new place, a quaint little house near the edge of a peaceful town. It was everything they'd been looking for. quiet, cozy, and surrounded by thick woods. On their first night, they felt the thrill of starting fresh and set about unpacking. But as they did, Brian noticed something odd, a strange metal hatch in the floor of the hallway closet. It looked like it led down to a small crawl space, one he assumed was for storage or maybe access to the plumbing. The hatch was padlocked, and though Brian was curious, he figured it was just an old lock no one had bothered to remove. They let it be and went on with setting up their lives. A few nights in, Megan woke up to the sound of faint scratching. It was so light that she wondered if it was just the wind or a branch brushing against the house. She nudged Brian awake, but by the time he opened his eyes, the noise had stopped. They dismissed it and went back to sleep, but the following night, it happened again. This time, the scratching was louder, closer. It seemed to come from beneath them, from the floor, as though something was trying to claw its way up from below. The next morning, Brian checked the hatch in the hallway closet, hoping for an explanation. The padlock was still there, rusty and untouched, but when he leaned closer, he noticed deep scratches along the edges of the hatch, as though someone or something had been prying at it from the other side. He kept this detail to himself, not wanting to alarm Megan, but that night, the scratching started again, more persistent than before. They tried to sleep, but the scratching was unrelenting, almost frantic. Megan was visibly shaken, her eyes darting toward the hallway every time the noise started up. Finally, Brian couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, he decided to pry the hatch open and see what was causing the noise. As he wedged the crowbar between the hatch and the floor, he noticed an odd, musty smell drifting up. With a hard push, the rusty lock snapped, and the hatch creaked open, revealing a narrow wooden ladder descending into darkness. Megan stood back, nervously clutching a flashlight as Brian cautiously climbed down. The space below was cramped, barely high enough to stand. The air was thick and stale, and Brian had to cover his nose to block out the putrid smell that seemed to hang there. As he shined his flashlight around, he noticed something strange on the walls. Crude markings, scratched into the wood. They were stick figures, hundreds of them, drawn over and over, sometimes overlapping, sometimes half erased. It was as if a child had spent hours, days even, etching these figures into the walls. He shivered, uneasy, and decided to head back up. Just as he was about to climb the ladder, he felt a chill on the back of his neck, as if someone was breathing right behind him. He turned, shining his flashlight frantically, but there was nothing there. That night, they tried to ignore the scratching, but it was louder, more insistent, echoing up from the depths of the crawl space. Then came the whispers, soft at first, growing louder as the hours crept on. A child's voice, faint and forlorn, drifting up from below. "Let me out. Please, let me out." Megan and Brian sat huddled together in bed, terrified, listening as the whispers turned into sobs, then shrieks, pleading and desperate. Just as dawn broke, the sounds stopped, plunging the house into an eerie silence. The next day, they called the previous owners, hoping for answers. After a long silence, the previous owner finally admitted that the house had a history. Years ago, a family had lived there with a little girl who had vanished without a trace. Some claimed she had run away. Others whispered that something far worse had happened. No one ever found her, but her presence was rumored to haunt the house, scratching and crying from the dark corners she could never escape. Desperate to rid themselves of the haunting, Megan and Brian sealed the hatch and covered it with heavy furniture, hoping that would keep whatever was down there from reaching them. But the scratching didn't stop. Each night it returned, louder than before, as though something was clawing at the wood, trying to push the furniture aside, desperate to escape. They moved out after a month, leaving the house and its haunting behind, but sometimes, in the dead of night, they could still hear it. A faint scratching, a distant whisper, echoing in their minds long after they left.